So our next speaker is Paul Roberts, technical specialist with Microsoft with over 30 years of experience in the fields of networking security, currently focusing on Microsoft's IoT platform. Paul joined Microsoft as a CyberX acquisition. Paul's knowledge in IoT and OT, vulnerability management, conditioning, and threat monitoring is going to be our topic today. So digital transformation by securing your IT devices with IoT. Please join the stage, Paul. Let's give a warm welcome. I know we're going long, but thank you. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. So good morning, just. I'd like to go through a couple of points. So the first is really Microsoft's vision around securing IoT devices, but also what we're seeing in the marketplace and how we can kind of work in synergy with other platforms. So the first part, if this will work. So just to give you some context, I know there's been a lot of conversation around platforms such as identity and monitoring, etc. this morning, and threat intelligence. So Microsoft has added, through acquisitions, some of these platforms. So I'm originally from CyberX, which is one of the acquisitions. There's also platforms that look at firmware, look at identity, and so on. And it may surprise you that Microsoft is a $16 billion security company. Certainly surprised me when I found out. If we look at some of the challenges, and as you can see, there's statistics. Everybody loves statistics. So we're looking at some of the challenges and how companies feel, how the CIOs feel around adopting IoT. And this could be the realization that they have internal systems already that aren't secure, or it could be that they're looking at how they can secure platforms moving forward as they go through this digital transformation phase of maybe moving from a completely air-gapped platform into industrial IoT or IoT at the edge. I mean, think smart meters for electricity companies. These are IoT devices that the company owns that are now out on the end user's site. So they're vulnerable and they need protecting. And companies are starting to realize that IoT is a critical path moving forward. But they're also worried about how do they protect these devices. They are intrinsically vulnerable to attack. They've got no control over these. They're at the end customer's site. They can't protect it with a traditional network type intrusion platform. And looking at the gaps, well, we've got in some cases devices that are insecure by design. So I'm going to include industrial control systems in this. The devices themselves weren't built with security in mind, so they are inherently vulnerable. So these are some of the key concerns that we're seeing when we talk to these companies. We talk to CIOs, we talk to CISOs, and we want to try and understand, what are their concerns and how can we start addressing these? Well, if we start by kind of trying to use the existing solutions. So as an example, a firewall. Well, a firewall is great at protecting the perimeter, but as the perimeter increases, and we've seen this with COVID, where a company had all the protection for their users on premise, but as the users started working from home, that perimeter kind of broke down. So the firewall's great for protecting the perimeter, but what do we do with devices outside the perimeter? Well, internally on a network, we could use a NAC. Well, a NAC's very complex, and a NAC is hard to maintain as well. Vulnerability scanners. Well, again, vulnerability scanners work within the enterprise, but they don't work in a divested solution. And they certainly don't work with IoT devices. And the last part is agents. We love agents. We're quite happy installing software on the endpoint. But again, we're getting into these IoT devices that don't support an agent. You cannot load an agent onto a PLC, for example. A lot of IoT devices, you can't load an agent onto these either. So yeah, the existing solutions, although they have their place, absolutely, yeah, we need to look at other solutions, and we need to get a better understanding of what we can do to protect these. And yeah, there's a few ways of looking at this. So we can start with cloud-based solutions. If we've got a diverse infrastructure, you know, we've got, and I'm going to use smart meters again, we've got smart meters on our consumers' sites. We've got ATMs at a branch in a bank. We may have an ATM in a hotel, for example. How do we protect these? How do we get data from those back to a common platform? So for that, we need to start looking at how we can use the cloud. We might have devices sat at the edge of the network. So we have a small cluster of devices. You know, we can start using some of that intelligent edge infrastructure to protect, you know, clusters of devices. And it might go as far as to say we've got remote facilities. Well, we can use edge devices to protect the unprotected and the vulnerable devices at the edge. And then as well, we've got the end devices themselves. And you've already heard from some of the previous speakers how devices themselves are becoming more intelligent. So we can start looking at what we can do with those devices, working with the device builders. And I think Mr. Kaspersky said there are more and more companies are starting to invest in secure devices at the edge. So we are becoming more aware of how this works. So if we look at a typical strategy, and yes, I'm using the Microsoft slide, but we want to look at enabling the security operations team. So far, you'll probably find in your SOC that a lot of the team are highly focused on IT security. They understand this to a great depth, but they probably don't understand what happens when you have an issue in the IoT world, because these things are different. So we need to have that unified coverage, or we need to understand how we can work with the data that's flowing in and the best teams internally to be able to support that. With all of the protocols that are coming out, every vendor has their own protocol. There seems to be very few standards, but we need to get a platform that understands all of these different protocols. Now, in the IoT world, we're starting to see things like MQTT, etc. But that's an encrypted protocol. Thankfully, it's becoming a standard, so we are able to start using it. We are able to start understanding what it means and how it works. But certainly, if we look at ICS protocols, every vendor has their own protocol. They're all using their own individual standard for this. And then the embedded devices that are being shipped out. Now, as a consumer, I could cite a Sonos speaker, or I could cite a printer. These are embedded operating systems on the end device. And again, they're looking at being functional. They're not being built to be secure. And then the last piece is the life cycle of these devices. So devices age over time. And devices get installed into a network, and I'm guilty of this as well. I have devices at home that I don't bother updating the firmware on. So I'm running a printer at home that maybe has software on it that's 2 or 3 years old. And if you extend this out to a corporate environment where IoT devices are not managed properly or they're forgotten about, we're starting to see that there's a huge number of gaps in the security platform. So there's kind of 3 key areas. The first one being, let's say, the ICS environment. So managing that is completely different to managing your IT network. You may have a great understanding of what happens on a platform in the IT world, so endpoints, servers, etc. If you want to force an update on a user, it's great. You can force that user to update the firmware on their laptop. But you can't have the same approach within the ICS network. We can't actively do anything in the ICS network because those devices are vulnerable. So we need to have an approach for those kind of platforms. If we look at devices on the edge, so again, I keep using the example of a smart meter, but it kind of gets the point across. These are devices that are sat on their own at the edge of the network, on a consumer's location. So there's a better way of protecting those. And again, we start looking at secure operating systems, secure platforms. Maybe we're getting to the point where we can load an agent onto those devices. And then across into the IT environment. So again, I mentioned that everyone loves an agent. You heard from the gentleman from CrowdStrike as well about protecting those IT assets. Well, there's also the realm of shadow IT, of devices that aren't part of your corporate ecosystem. So do you know what's there? Can you understand what they're doing? And it may be a device that you've sanctioned. Again, it might be a printer, it might be a CCTV camera, but it could also be the device that the user themselves has bought in and connected to the network. It might be something like a smart speaker. It could be something like a Raspberry Pi. But do you know it's there? Do you understand what it's doing? And all of these are starting to become serious concerns within the enterprise and trying to get a better understanding of exactly what's happening. So if we look at the ICS type devices, and sorry, I'm going to start walking the other way, I'm making myself dizzy. If we look at the ICS type of devices, so the production line or the supply chain, chances are there isn't an understanding of what devices are in this environment. It's an environment that's grown and shrunk over time. No one's got an exact handle on what's there. So the first thing we need to do is discover what's in the environment. If you don't know what's there, you can't build a strategy to protect it. We need to then look at the risk that's posed by these devices. Are they vulnerable? In a lot of cases, an ICS environment, it's very much looked at as, if it's not broken, I'm going to leave it alone. So there will be kind of built-in vulnerabilities to that. We need to understand what threats are in the environment. We need to know how to respond to these, because the response in an ICS environment is going to be different to the response in an IT environment. And looking at how we detect these, having a static list of what those devices are is fine, but we can start applying some intelligence to that. We know what those devices are, what they're doing, but we can use machine learning to understand their behavior. We can build out a list of what those devices are, who they're communicating with, what their firmware is, how vulnerable they are to various attacks, and understand how we can better protect them. And it may well be that we're not just looking at the end devices themselves and saying, we need to upgrade the firmware. Maybe we can't. So what we need to do is look on a wider scope around the rest of the network to understand if there's any way we can break access to those devices from any threats that may evolve in our network. And having that inventory is really key. Now, again, I'm using a product slide, so apologies for this. But gaining visibility of what's in the network is absolutely key to how we react, how we build a security policy. You can't protect what you don't know. So the first thing is about getting that asset inventory. We can then start looking at how vulnerable those devices are. So once you understand that, okay, I've got a printer, well, the printer's running an old version of firmware. So if the printer is still supported, great, you can upgrade the firmware on it. You've better protected that device. But if you can't upgrade the firmware, having an understanding of the vulnerability is absolutely key. A recognized vulnerability is better than just not knowing anything at all and burying your head in the sand. If we look at the devices at the edge, so those ATMs or the smart meters, the idea of just buying something off the shelf and deploying it, has gone. but who are we reliant on to provide the security? Do we take those devices ourselves and try and make them more secure? Or do we work with the vendor? Do we work with the OEM manufacturer and say, look, here is my requirement for a device. It has functional requirements. It has to act as a smart meter, for example, but it also has security requirements. So here's in 2 stages, my firmware requirements for that device. This is what it has to have in terms of the functional piece. But again, this is what it has to have in security. Certainly in the UK, power prices are increasing, so companies are becoming more worried about their smart meters being meddled with. Nobody wants to pay more for electricity. So having the visibility on that device, being able to secure it, is starting to become key. And a lot has been mentioned already about threat intelligence backing all of this up. So having all of the information around what the asset is, how vulnerable it is, and emerging threats, you need to understand in the future what's going to happen. So everyone can make a prediction. And I know that, again, some of the previous presentations have talked about the importance of threat intelligence. But having that data coming into the network, being able to disseminate what's good and what's bad, and understanding what's going to be forming a threat is absolutely key. And finally, kind of wrapping all of that up, getting this big flow of data is great, but you need to be able to combine that into usable alerts, usable information. So having all of that pouring into one key platform where you can see all of the threats, you can correlate this from the IT environment to the OT environment and to the IoT environment. So there is another statistic somewhere that says 80% of the threats with your IoT devices come from the IT world. So it makes sense having all of this information joined together so that you can start tracking it, you can see where these threats are coming from, and it gives you a better way of responding to them. Okay, I've got to mention it. I work for Microsoft, so apologies. But pushing it into an intelligent SIEM platform, that's going to give you the visibility over what's happening, how to respond, what SOAR functionality you can use. But also having all of that data doesn't just give you the ability to respond to it. It gives you the ability to report on where your weaknesses are. So aligning with something like the MITRE ATT&CK framework, putting data into a business intelligence platform that can show you how vulnerable your devices are. And you can categorize that into devices that you can't do anything about, because again, they may be out of date, there may not be firmware available for that, or devices that you can go through a process and a life cycle of the update, through to your employees, how many employees you have, and what level they're trained to. This again can help you understand where you need to improve the environment in which your devices are sitting. So I know this isn't supposed to be a product pitch, so sorry about this. But in terms of what Microsoft can offer, we can stretch from the IT network across to the ICS network. There's various sensor options that we can utilize. We provide agentless and agent-based solutions. So we can do all of the monitoring element, but you still need to do something to cobble all that together to be able to manage and monitor it properly. And again, we've mentioned threat intelligence, but having that massive pool of data, and there are threat feeds from multiple different companies. So absolutely, we can provide one of those. There's other companies out who are here today who can provide other threat feeds. But the more information that you have, the better protected your environment is going to be. So I know I've rattled through that, but thank you very much. And are there any questions? Oh, sorry.
Hello, Paul.
Hi.
Thank you for your insightful presentation. My name is Abdullah from Taqa company. Regarding the inventorying IoT devices,
Yeah.
is Microsoft able to identify all these devices, regardless of their types, or not? This is the first question. Also, the second question is the information of IoT devices will be automatically registered or not? Thank you.
Yeah, so there's obviously going to be some kinds of hardware that someone builds that we won't be able to recognize. But as an example, if you put us into a typical corporate network, then absolutely we'll see the likes of a Raspberry Pi, Sonos speaker, a printer, etc. We will look at what a device is, who the vendor is, and what it's doing on the network. Because obviously a printer is going to exhibit different characteristics to a CCTV camera. So we are able to make calculations and decisions based on what the device is and what it's doing on the network. Obviously, if we see something like an HP device, it's going to be announcing itself on the network. We can also understand what it's doing. We can actively scan that device because it's in the IT environment to get that information off of the device. So a lot of cases, these devices will tell us what they are. So by using SNMP, for example, you can run a scan on a device and it will come back and say, yes, I'm a printer, and this is my model number. And I do apologize, I've forgotten your second question. Yeah. Yes, so in the IT world, in the IT environment, if you're using Defender for Endpoint, yes, it will automatically scan the network. So as soon as you plug your device in, it starts scanning. Thank you.